Welcome to Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast series about communication skills in the workplace. I'm your host, John Witzman. Join me as I speak with industry professionals and Conestoga faculty and alumni to explore their journeys with reading and writing skills. Follow us as we talk about how communications learning has changed over the years, how these skills are used in a wide range of industries, and the future of workplace communications. And hello, I'm here today with Sergeant Daniel Mills, Senior Recruiter at the Ontario Provincial Police Northwest Region. Dan, welcome. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So on Reading and Writing Between the Lines, we talk to our guests about how they use communication skills in their particular line of work. As I mentioned, you're a senior recruiter for the Ontario Provincial Police. Before we dive in, can you just tell us briefly what that role entails and the work that you do?
So with the Ontario Provincial Police, we have an entire unit that we consider our uniform recruitment unit. And we're responsible for, I suppose it would be like processing of applications, recruiting applicants. So being out in the public and doing outreach events, interviewing applicants and writing reports based on those interviews as well. And the senior piece is just a fancy word for I'm an old officer. And it's usually we label our senior recruiters. That's the sergeant rank within our unit. We have constable level recruiters within our unit as well. So the senior recruiters are our sergeant levels.
Well, great. Between your experience as a law enforcement officer and your current role in recruitment, I'm sure you're going to have lots to share with us in terms of how communication skills are used in the day-to-day life of a police officer. Before we get into that part of the conversation, I'd love to take you back to your early educational days, if we can get that far back. Because I'm always interested to know what it was like for you to learn this material when you were being asked to develop your communication skills. What was that experience like for you?
That's a very layered question. When I was young, I wouldn't say that I was the best student, and I would say that English and language weren't my strengths by any means. I really had to work at, like, I can remember, like, in elementary school, like I didn't have the focus to sit and read for long periods of time. And I found my mind drifting often, and I would have to go back and read, like I'd have to go back 3 pages because my mind was on something else. So and I don't think that I'm unique in that. I think that's it's very common. And I feel like probably more today with all the distractions in the world. But it was, I would say one of the pivotal things in my education in my younger years when I was in high school. I had a project to do, and I believe it was I was either grade 11 or grade 12 English, and I had to do a report on a book. I think it was Shardik, and it was like it was this big deal, and we had to do this presentation on our project and different things like that. And it was just like I was just so gripped by public speaking. It was like this fear that I had, and I couldn't. There was a block there, and I couldn't get past it. And so it was my turn to present, and I was up at the front, and I started, and things were actually going relatively well. And I just looked outside, and it was pouring rain, and I just remember thinking, "Oh, it's raining." And then that was it. I was stumped from that point on, and it was one of the most embarrassing things that I've gone through, and I couldn't recover from it, and I couldn't get my composure. And I'm this grade 11 kid who wants to be popular and wants to have friends, and I'm just a bit of a mess, and it was emotional. I became emotional because it was a significant event, and it was like pass or fail kind of thing. And I knew I was going to be failing the course. So my teacher was very kind and told me, like, if you can collect yourself and do it tomorrow. And it was such a bad experience that I took the failing grade in that
Wow.
English class because it was so traumatic for me.
Wow. That's a really powerful story. Thank you for sharing it with us. And especially because I know that there are people listening who would be able to relate to, several parts of that story. Both the sort of the early days where you felt a sense that it just wasn't clicking for you. And it was an effort to anchor yourself back into the material. Then, of course, that public speaking experience that you described, I know is something that many people can relate to, and that feeling of being in a moment that is getting away from you. I certainly can relate to it as well. And the detail that you can recall it with, right? The being able to picture looking out the window and seeing the rain, and I bet I bet you can. There's a part of you that's there right now. Let me try to take you away from there though, because I'm curious to know, uh, you know, especially with that background and those early experiences, to find yourself where you are now, where you're talking to me on this podcast, and you host a podcast of your own, and a big part of your professional life now is speaking to people and presenting yourself to the world. What changed? Was there? Do you recall a time in the schooling days, or was it after when you started to feel more comfortable in that kind of a communication role?
I don't know if there was like a moment where I
Yeah,
figured it out.
right.
I think it was just like
There
through
usually isn't,
life.
right? Yeah,
Yeah, it was just through life, and um, it comes largely back to preparation, and for me, it's like if I have command of the knowledge, and if
right.
I have an intimacy with the knowledge, then I know nobody knows more than me about it.
Yeah,
And
and you can gain confidence from that.
it's really easy to present that, right? It's when you're
Right,
unsure, you're not prepared, you're winging it,
right.
and I've learned to wing it a lot. Um,
Sure.
but you still have those nerves in that pit in your stomach when you're winging it,
Right.
right? So I think it's just for me, I believe it's just a matter of like preparation, making sure that you're prepared and you have studied the knowledge you or the information, and you have a good base of what you're presenting.
I think that's really good advice, and I think a really sharp insight that there probably isn't a pivotal moment when everything changes in terms of one's approach to anything. Really, it's a layering, steady repetition that builds muscle and familiarity and confidence and experience over time. So on the theme of preparation, I'm curious to know when you were going through your studies and you were taking courses like communications class that you might have had to take in your first year of undergrad. Let's say these English courses, these communication courses tend to be mandatory. Did you have the sense then that this was something that you were doing to help prepare you for future work? Were you already aspiring towards work in law enforcement at that time?
Well, I'd always kind of had an interest in law enforcement from a young age. I'm old, so I'm 52 now. So when I was like coming out of high school, going into my post secondary journey, it was in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was very difficult to get a job as a police officer at the time.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I had kind of like at the time it was like, hey, I'm either going to be a gym teacher
Right.
or a police officer, and that's not necessarily an option. But I also didn't have a lot of confidence, and because of my like I don't know how to put it, because of my like lack of like investment or success maybe in high school with a lot of like my grades, I
Yeah.
didn't feel like I could follow that university path. So
Right.
I ended up going to college and I took a general sciences course. And then I got into paramedicine. So I took a paramedic course, and I ended up working as a paramedic for a little while before policing. But there was no real, like, I don't think that there was like anything in me when I was pursuing my education that was like, oh, I'm really gonna nail this communications course because I'm
Right.
gonna do a bunch of presenting in my future.
Right. No, and it's funny how difficult that can be to connect the dots when you're moving forward. The dots might line up looking back on our journey, and you can see how one step led to another along the path to here. But I think again, it's really useful probably for many of our younger listeners to hear you acknowledge that in that moment there's a much fuzzier sense of the way forward, and of course that's a big part of our purpose for having these conversations is to uh, try and help people find motivation and find purpose in certain aspects of their studies right now. Um, you had um, spoken just now about some of the courses that you gravitated towards, the paramedical in particular. I picture that as being very hands on. Do you remember um, having a sense in your post secondary journey? You called it. I think that's a great word. This time of life, that stage of life, post secondary studies is very much like a journey as people are kind of forging a path, right? They're finding their way, and often we're making decisions that can feel big. Do you remember communications, reading, writing, speaking skills? Did that feel like a fork in the road? Did it feel like, okay, that's an area where I'm not so comfortable, so I'm going to steer around it? Was the paramedicine in part a choice that you took because it was hands-on, because it wasn't as much of a reading and writing type path?
I wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say that. No, largely I would say no to that.
Yeah,
I think I gravitated toward, and I'm a very very practical learner. So even like in the paramedic world, like doing scenario based training
yeah,
and practicing practical skills training and different things like that. That's where that's my strength in learning. And even in a policing world, there's a lot of practical skills learning.
yeah,
It's sometimes a physical job, right? And there's
yeah.
different skills that we have to learn that, like they're performance based skills.
Absolutely.
There's a knowledge component to both of those careers, but I often found that the other came easier for me. I would have to work harder at the other thing. And so I don't know if it's just like, okay, the stream is going this way and
Yeah,
this part of the stream is a little bit easier. So that's where I gotta focus my energies. I don't know, but I mean, I never steered away.
right.
Regardless of the high school experience that I have, I never really steered away from communication because I did understand. I think even like in my college years, I did understand how important communication was as a paramedic. Like even without like the foresight of knowing where I'd be today, I think maybe for your listeners, like just like it's a core skill, that everybody needs for everything that they're going to do. And it's not just as a recruiter with the OPP, it's as a server at Kelsey's
Right.
or whatever that looks like for people, right? Being able to communicate effectively through all of the different ways that we communicate is crucial, right? And whether it's language, paralanguage, kinesics, like there's all kinds of different ways that we communicate. And
What
I
a
think
great
that it's
opportunity for us to segue into to the present day. Yeah, and maybe even we'll go just a little bit farther back in your career. Can you give us a sense of what it's like in the day-to-day experience of a police officer? Probably different than the television shows and the movies that we're used to watching. How do you remember in some of your earlier days in the field, using those many communication skills that you just laid out, in the various ways. What are some of the examples or that come to mind first in terms of how that's a part of your toolkit?
I think that, like we use communication daily, right? Like, so whether it's between, whether it's at the start of our shift with our managers or supervisors who are kind of maybe asking us for tasks to be done or responsibilities, or if they want you to patrol a certain zone or focus on a certain, area of town that might be more susceptible to crime. So again, that communication is always there. We're always writing in our notebook. Again, it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be like complete sentences and
Right.
like essay format. It's usually just like point form stuff that you just to refresh your memory so that when you do write your reports, you have all that information there. So we're collecting that information and we're jotting it down quickly so that we can actually sit down and spend some time to type an accurate report of maybe something that's happened, right? As
I'm
we
really
talk to,
Yeah,
go
I'm
ahead.
really interested in the notebook and the report writing that happens afterwards, because I think that's such a direct link to the kinds of skills that people are using and developing in an academic context, right? So even though the stakes are much higher, sitting in a class trying to record notes from what you're seeing at the front of a classroom, so that you can then retain that knowledge, come back and use those ideas later to put together into a project, seems to be pretty comparable to making contemporaneous notes in the field so that you can then document it. Can you tell me more about what that was like for you to develop the skill set or the technique to write notes? Do you remember that? Do you remember that being a struggle at first? Do you remember coming back to your notebook and saying, "Wait, what was I saying here?" and having a hard time?
Yeah, I think it's always a struggle when you
Yeah.
first start and you're new to it. And I was never, I would say that was never a skill that I've perfected by
Okay.
any means.
Yeah.
I always felt like I not struggled, but I could always improve or do better, even in school, writing notes like in class and
Yeah.
then trying to figure out what it all meant, sometimes was not my strength, right? So but it just takes time and you just got to keep at it and keep doing it and doing it and doing it. And you'll find your way. And even like writing reports, everybody's got a style,
Okay.
right? That they usually end up finding, like, and the more repetitive it can be, sometimes it's a matter of like, I have a report that I constantly use because I like the format. I like how it's laid out. I can make sure that I get all the information out accurately. So it's like always going to be like A, B, C, D,
Yes.
E,
Yeah.
right? And it's always laid out a certain way every time. That way I don't forget things, right? And there's often been times that I've written notes in my notebook and then look back on it and then like I have no idea. And the more separation there is from the event to the
Sure.
notes to the actual report writing, the harder it becomes, right?
Absolutely.
So the advice that I usually give is like, make notes as quickly as you can after getting the information. And then as soon as you can get to the office in our world, as soon as you can get to the office and then write the report while it's still fresh in your memory and you can still remember like writing the notes and why you wrote the notes and why you wrote them the way you wrote them,
Right.
right? The easier it is to write that report then.
I'm fascinated to discover how much sort of personal customization or choice there is in the writing of your reports. The way that you described sort of finding your way to a style, to a format, to a template that you liked and felt comfortable. I'm curious to know, is there much coaching or sort of top down instruction in terms of expectations when it comes to the written documentation of those observations and notes?
Yeah, as a new officer, you're going to be given a lot of direction early on. And your coach officer, the person who's responsible for mentoring you, should be looking at your notes, making sure that you're getting everything that you should be getting in your notes, and they'll be helping you write the reports initially, and they'll be looking at your
Okay.
reports, while you're on your own. And then there's always like different levels of supervisors that are taking a look at your reports as well to approve them. And if there's something lacking in them, then they may send you a task to fix them up or bolster them somehow.
Is that something that you remember being sort of surprised by, or maybe even your colleagues as well in the early days? Did you all kind of look at each other and say, "I didn't realize there would be so much writing in this job"? Uh,
Well, I think it varies from job to job within the OPP too. Like the
okay,
job that I'm in right now, there's a ton of writing, right? Because we're always writing reports on applicants and different
right.
things like that. So, and we're always like typing notes while we're doing interviews, and there's just a ton of writing. And the job that I had before in the training unit, so I was in the training unit for about 12 years before I came into uniform recruitment, and like it was all just teaching, right? Like I
Right.
wasn't writing, I wasn't typing anything. So it was communication, but a different type of communication, right?
Absolutely. Maybe we can dive into that experience when you were teaching and in the training role. Um, how did you find that experience of trying to summarize information and present information in a way that would be clear, but also hold the interest of your students? Did you find that there were sort of bumps along that road as well in terms of developing those skills?
I I found it easy.
Okay,
I
it came
I
naturally to you.
I I just feel like that was one of those things that is just like it was soothing for me. I
Nice.
found it very easy to take information. Like and again, I looked at myself as a conduit,
Yep.
right? So I was like, the OPP would have a course training standard on whatever the subject was.
Right.
I made myself intimately familiar with the information. And then I was just a conduit, right? So I was taking this information and giving it to others. And I think understanding that everybody kind of has their own learning style
Hmm.
was really important for me, because I knew that some people, if I presented a certain way, sometimes there might be a couple people in the class who might not completely be understanding what I was saying, or might not connect the dots fully, right? So
Yeah.
I made sure I presented it in a couple different ways, just so that I could make sure collectively that the group would fully understand it.
It sounds like great
Um,
teaching. I love that framing, that image of you as teacher, as conduit. That your job is not to be the source of the knowledge. That this relationship is not defined by my personal knowledge and wisdom being sort of transferred upon you, but rather you're a prism that is sort of reflecting and refracting this knowledge set out, and that through you, students can connect to that material better. I think uh, I'm curious to know whether that's something that um, you could imagine yourself doing earlier in your career. That insight. Do you think that came to you only through the years of repetition being on the job, or do you think that maybe that was just something more naturally in you?
I think it was more naturally in me, and I think it might be partly the product of like my journey and my path, and the
Mhm.
and kind of like I understood. I think I understood early who I was as a learner,
Yeah,
right? and
absolutely.
and what and what my learning style was,
Yeah,
and where my strengths lied as a learner, and areas that I wasn't so strong. So I think when you understand your strengths and limitations, you can empathize with other people that they may have strength and limitations in those areas, or maybe completely opposite of
yeah,
what your strengths and limitations, right? So what's is there any better or worse? Is there right or wrong? No, there
right.
isn't. It
Yeah,
just is, right?
yeah,
So you just have to figure that out. And I really try to get to know the learners in my class, and try to figure them out. Like, was part of the game that I was
right.
playing, was trying to figure out like, hey, what is your learning style? How can I help you learn better? Right. And I that was my passion. And it really, like, it
Sounds like
really
maybe you miss
allowed
being
me.
in that role.
I do actually. I do a lot.
Yeah.
I don't dislike the role I'm in now,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
I feel like that was just where I kind of fit. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
I like how you also said that your teaching process began with gaining an intimate understanding of the course outcomes, the learning outcomes, what students needed to get from that, and that strikes me as another communications related skill set that your success in that role was sort of rooted in your not only your ability to get that information out of its sort of raw state, whatever it came. I imagine that those course learning outcomes came to you in a fairly thick book of some form, and that a considerable amount of reading and critical thinking skill would have been applied to get that information out of that sort of inert state and into your understanding in a way that, like you described, was intimate, right? That allowed you to riff, that allowed you to go off book and get to the level of individuals to make those personal connections. I mean, that's a
but
pretty.
I think it also, to interrupt you, I think it's also like there's a huge piece of personal experience that goes into that, and like experiential learning on my own part that goes into that as well, right? Like, for example, I'll use an example in our training unit. Part of one of our responsibilities was to teach first aid and CPR every three on a 3-year cycle,
Right,
right? And my experience as a paramedic gave me an intimate knowledge
right,
of that course, right? To be able to teach it to a level that wasn't just like reading off of a PowerPoint or
right,
reading the information from a book. It was like,
right.
hey, I know this, I've lived this, right? And then being able to share some experiences from my background to help me make points, right? As I presented the information.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I imagine your experience in the training role has also given you a similar kind of experience now that you're in a recruitment role to be able to share with potential recruits what you're really looking for, what's needed to give them a really intimate insight into what the next steps might be, and also to be able to support the recruitment process from the hiring side to have a really keen insight into what what applicants might be more viable than others. Maybe we can transition into that part of your career now. I'm really curious to know so much about that recruitment role. When you're meeting people in the outreach that you do, and when you're reviewing people's applications, what stands out to you first in terms of a young person's sort of communications profile? What are some of the things that jump off the page or stand out in a face-to-face interaction that make you say either, oh, this person's showing me they've got a really sort of deep command of communication skills, or maybe this is revealing somebody to have a weakness in this area?
So that's a very layered question. So I so first things like how you present yourself says a lot, right? Like, that's communication. As you walk up to me, you're communicating to me,
Absolutely.
right?
And
And
those are the
again,
kinesics that you talked about earlier,
yeah,
right?
yeah. So if it's like confident, shoulders back, not chest out necessarily,
Right.
but
Yeah.
in an upright position, right?
Yeah.
Eye contact, like command of your own body, a nice introduction is always good. And again, it's not only professional, but it just shows that you're invested. It just shows that you're invested. So, and I guess that's it, what I would say would be like an ideal kind of a first impression
Yep.
type of an interaction. But I also understand that culturally that looks different from
So
culture to
true.
culture to culture,
So true.
right? And I have to be aware of that in my role, right? And I can't be critical of somebody who might not make eye contact, who might have their head down, because that might not necessarily be a confidence issue or something like that. That just could just be a cultural practice.
Yeah.
So I have to be mindful of that,
That's
right?
it's really complex. You're right, and there's the layering that you talked about. What about on paper? I remember when I was in a position once that required me to do some vetting of the sort of first round of applicants. It was the first time that I had done that, and I was surprised to discover how many people spelled the name of the company incorrectly, or spelled the name of the individual that they were writing to individually incorrectly. And on the one hand, it was just a spelling mistake, but on the other hand, it did really speak volumes to me in terms of a person's attention to detail and their approach to the professionalism of this process. And when there were so many applicants, it had to be, it was a very straightforward sort of factor in the initial sorting. Are there certain for all the potential sort of applicants that are listening now, are there some common errors that you tend to see most sort of jumping off the page when you're looking at a written application or a written document?
I wouldn't say common errors, but like you'd mentioned, attention to detail.
Right.
So one thing that when I'm doing any mentoring, so I do a lot of sessions one-on-one with people who are interested, who have reached out to me. We make arrangements to talk, and I'll either sit down with them just on a phone call, or I'll talk to them virtually, or sometimes if they're in the area, I'm able to meet with them in person. But I do mentoring, and we have 10 areas of assessment that we look at, and communication skills is one of them. And so part of the message that I'm trying to give them is like, from the minute you emailed me, the
Right.
OPP is assessing
Yes.
your communication skills. Are your responses timely? Is your grammar appropriate? Is your spelling okay? Right? Like, we all make spelling mistakes.
Right.
And again, but I think with today, with texting and the abbreviations and different things like that, I think that it's easy for people to become complacent in communication,
Right.
And not treating it as an opportunity to make a good impression sometimes, right? KK, like, no, not KK, right? It's like, yes, okay, Sergeant Mills, thank you so
Right.
much, right? Like, just
Yes,
different things like that.
absolutely.
And there's a level of professionalism that you should aspire to as you're
Right.
applying to a professional job, right? So we start community. So usually I tell people, like, make sure you're thorough with your application. Provide all the detail that's required, that we ask for, because we're asking for it for a reason. And if you're putting it in and it's like, that's good enough, is
Right.
it good enough?
Right.
Is it? Right?
Yeah.
And again, paying attention to detail, and you mentioned spelling and grammar and different things like that. Like, we're seeing those. It might not be a deal breaker
No.
necessarily,
Right.
but it's definitely a consideration, because down the road, if you do get hired, you're going to have to be writing reports and communicating with the public, and maybe providing protection for the Premier of Ontario, right?
Right.
Like, that's one of the roles that our officers provide.
Right.
And it's like, how are you going to present yourself? How are you going to communicate with them?
I think you've done such a great job of connecting the dots between something that might justifiably seem to somebody at the sort of early stage of their professional career. It might seem like a minor thing, and I think that you've helped them to see how it's part of a bigger picture, and so that word complacency, I think, is a really important one, because it helps somebody understands how these are all elements of our presentation, not just in the abstract sense of how we exist in the world, but how we relate to another person. and how we view our role within a relationship or within a group or within a job. And that idea that, and this is a term that I come back to in I think just about every conversation I have on this podcast. Audience and purpose is a sort of fundamental sort of toolkit that we use in our communications training, right? Who am I communicating to? What are their expectations of me? What do I know about them? What am I trying to? What do they need from me? And also, what's my purpose? What's my objective? What am I trying to accomplish? And the attention to detail that you're talking about, the awareness that these things matter in a professional context and that they might matter to my audience. That's the I think the bigger picture is not that you need to be able to spell every word correctly first time that you write it down, but that you know that eventually when it goes public, when it's seen by somebody, it should look a certain way. And so I as long as I attend to it before it goes out the door, before I click send, that's all I think that you're looking for, is that awareness, that understanding that there's a set of expectations, and that I need to conform to them, that I need to participate in this exchange of a professional realm, right? When we're texting each other about the barbecue that you've invited me to, I'm not looking for your spelling, and you're not looking, and we can relax. But we have a higher standard for our professional lives because, like you said, more's on the line, right? We've got to hold ourselves to a higher standard, and that's one of the ways that we can tell someone's ready.
I think it comes down to self-respect as well. Like I think that that's a big piece. Like the more professional you are, the better you communicate is a big indicator of like self-respect, I find, and how you respect the other person and how you view them as well. So
I think that's an important message for people to hear.
I think that that's a big thing. And I love the audience and purpose that you talk about, because I talk about it in different, I've never framed it quite like that. But I talk about it all the time. I talk about like, who are you present? Like I myself, even when I present to a police foundations class or a police studies class, it's a much different looking presentation than I would do at a public event,
right,
with people who have no skin in the game, right? They're not following this path of
right,
like, I want to be a police officer yet. I'm just planting seeds in the public information session, right? So it's a different message, and it's a different vibe, right? And
and being
the
able
audience,
to change that message and change that vibe depending on what situation, that is an incredibly important skill set. Absolutely. And I imagine for people who are in the public facing role of law enforcement, that's incredibly important to be able to, over the course of a day, the spectrum of people, of audiences that you must face, and is I imagine quite vast, and to be able to switch from role to role, voice to voice, demeanor to demeanor really requires a sophisticated command.
Well, and I just think it definitely requires a good awareness of people, right, and understanding people, right. So like us having our conversation here today is probably different than the conversation when my colleague walks in the office. It might be a little bit of a different conversation and a little bit of a different vibe, right? So when we're, as frontline officers, when we're dealing with, a guy in a welding shop who's been a welder for 25 years, I may have a different conversation with that person versus now I'm meeting with a CEO of a hospital or something, right? Where the conversation is very different. And then I have to transition to dealing with somebody who suffers from some type of a mental illness and talk with them and try to relate to them and have a connection with them as well. So we're always shifting gears and trying to figure out how to effectively communicate with people. And it's such a vast, diverse group of people that we're trying to connect with. sometimes it takes a little time to figure that out.
I can imagine, and those were three great examples to illustrate just how vast that range is. You talked about sort of switching gears, and it seems like a great opportunity for us to sort of look towards the future. You know, I think you're probably really well positioned given your work with recruits, and in your previous role and in a training capacity. To talk about where do you see the role of communications going within the policing law enforcement world with social media and text-based communications and digital communications, artificial intelligence. There's so much rapidly changing around us. How is that affecting your work personally? How is that affecting recruitment? How is that affecting the way that law enforcement professionals do their jobs?
I think that it's tough. It's tough to keep up. And like I said, I'm not young. Like I'm 52 and I've got 5 years to go and then I'm probably out the door. But I look at the AI space and Chat GPT and the different things that kind of are out there now. And I don't know exactly how that is going to fit into like our world in policing necessarily. I know that probably from an educational perspective, like
Sure.
you probably see a lot of that in like reports or assignments or different things like that. But I don't
Can you
see.
Can you see it affecting the way that you were talking about notes earlier? Are people starting to? I mean, the image of somebody taking out a little notepad and writing in the little notepad with their pen, even though that's how I would do it, in a way, it seems antiquated. Are people starting to field officers starting to use some of this technology in their note taking?
Yeah, we're piloting programs where your notes are just verbally dictated.
Yeah.
We've gone from we actually have a whole unit called civilian data entry unit, who now when officers want to like a lower end type of an incident,
Yep.
they will actually pick up the phone and they will dictate a report. Right. And then it will be recorded. And then our civilian data entry people will actually type it out onto our records management system. So
that's fascinating.
We are seeing changes in that space. And it depends on the role that you're in. I'm not seeing it as much like some of that's like, I don't experience some of that stuff in the role that I'm in now, but I know that it's there. I mean, we have computers in the vehicles now. We have cameras everywhere. We have body cameras everywhere.
Yeah.
So those things, that technology is, it's starting to be more and more and more present. What I see a lot of in my role is like the social media stuff and like we're using it as a tool a lot. We use it like, cause that's how people communicate now. So if you want people to know about the OPP and you want to promote the OPP and policing and change the perception sometimes of police in the public, then you have to have a social media presence, right?
Right. It's not Smokey the Bear commercials and Dare commercials like we might have been used to. Yeah.
And then on the other hand, from a recruitment perspective, I tell people like that I'm mentoring, like stay off of social media, stay away, right? Because I mean, we will get people who like if we might ask a question about alcohol consumption and people would be like, well, I barely drink. I might drink once every couple months or whatever. And then it's like, well, that's not what it seems like on your social media.
Yeah. Wow.
Right. And then it becomes less of an issue with the actual consumption of alcohol or overconsumption of alcohol. And it becomes an integrity issue.
Right.
Right. Because what you're saying isn't consistent with what you're showing on your social media. So I usually tell people to be mindful of that. And I mean,
and it comes back down to the awareness piece that we talked about earlier as well. Just a sense of an understanding of how many different versions of me there are and trying to be capable of sort of containing them all within one comprehensive piece.
Yeah. And what you show people and social media is communication, right? So you just have to be mindful that people are seeing that and people will be reading your posts and following your posts. And Again, what you think may be appropriate, others might not be think is appropriate too, right? So that's another consideration that you might have to have.
Well, even though it's a bit of a cautionary note, I think it's probably an excellent a piece of advice to wrap up on, practical and timely for all those who might be listening and aspiring towards a career in law enforcement. Sergeant Daniel Mills, thank you again so much for your time today and for sharing all of these terrific insights and experiences with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
And that marks the end of another episode of Reading and Writing Between the Lines, a podcast hosted by me, John Witzman, on behalf of the Communications Department and School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Conestoga College. You can find other episodes of this series on our YouTube channel, Reading and Writing Between the Lines. Stay tuned for more episodes. Thanks for listening.